Aleister Crowley's 81st Liber, The Butterfly Net, Chapter 14, an informative discourse upon the occult character of the moon, her threefold nature, her fourfold phases, and her 8 and 20 mansions, with an account of the events that preceded the climax of the great experiment, but especially of the vision of Iliel. Now, I know the lunar month, as most are going to reckon it, from sighting the crescent to sighting the crescent is 29 or 30 days, and the new moon to new moon is 29 and a half and some odd stuff. But there's that other, cycle of, what constellation we see it in and that sort of stuff. Between 27 and 28 days. The ancients, whose wisdom is so much despised by those who have never studied it, but content themselves with a pretense of understanding modern science which deceives nobody, would have smiled to observe how often the latest discoveries are equivalent to some fancy of Aristotle or some speculation of Heraclitus, the remoter Picay universities of America, which teach farming or mining with a little useless knowledge as a side course for show, are full of bumptious little professors who would not be allowed to sweep out a laboratory in London or Berlin. The ambition of such persons is to obtain an illustrated interview in a Sunday supplement with a full account of their wonderful discoveries, which have revolutionized the art of sucking eggs. They are peculiarly severe upon back numbers like Charles Darwin. Their ignorance leads them to believe the bombast of democracy flatters, who scream weekly of progress, and it really appears to them that anything more than 6 months old is out of date. They do not know that this is only true of loud-shouted mushroom rubbish, such as they call truth. The fundamental difference between ancient and modern science is not at all in the field of theory. Sir William Thomson was just as metaphysical as Pythagoras or Raymond Lully, and Lucretius quite as materialistic as Ernst Haeckel or Buchner. But we have devised means of accurate measurement, which they had not. And in consequence of this, our methods of classification are more quantitative than qualitative. The result has been to make much of their science unintelligible. We no longer know exactly what they meant by the 4 elements, or by the 3 active principles, sulfur, mercury, and salt. Some tradition has been preserved by societies of wise men, who, because of the persecutions, went to possess any other book than a missal might be construed as heresy, concealed themselves, and whispered the old teaching one to another. The 19th century saw the overthrow of most of the old ecclesiastical tyranny, and in the beginning of the 20th, it was found once more possible to make public the knowledge. The wise men gathered together, discovered a student who was trustworthy and possessed of the requisite literary ability, and by him the old knowledge was revised and made secure. It was finally published in a sort of periodical encyclopedia, already most impossible to find, such was the demand for it, entitled The Equinox. Now, in the science of antiquity, much classification depended upon the planets, those things which were hot and fiery in their nature, lions and peppers, and fevers, were classed under the sun or Jupiter or Mars, things swift and subtle under Mercury, things cold and heavy under Saturn, and so forth. Yet the principles of most of the planets appeared in varying proportions in almost everything, and the more equally these proportions were balanced and combined, the more complete was anything supposed to be. The nearer modeled on the divine perfection, man himself was called a microcosm, a little universe, an image of the Creator. In him, all the planets and elements had a course, and even the signs of the zodiac were represented in his nature. The energy of the ram was in his head. The bull gave the laborious endurance to his shoulders. The lion represented the courage of his heart and the fire of his temper. His knees, which help him to spring, are under the goat. All works in and is divided and subdivided in beauty and harmony. In this curious language, the moon signifies primarily all receptive things because moonlight is only reflected sunlight. Hence, lunar is almost a synonym of feminine. Woman changes. All depends upon the influence of the man, and she is now fertile, now barren, according to her phase. But on each day of her course, she passes through a certain section of the zodiac, and according to the supposed nature of the stars, beyond her was the influence in that phase, or as they called it, mansion. It was in order to bring Iliel into harmony with every quality of the moon that her daily routine was ordered. But beyond such minuteness of detail is the grand character of the moon, which is threefold, for she is Artemis or Diana, sister of the sun, a shining virgin goddess, then Isis, initiatrix, who brings to man all light and purity, and is the link of his animal soul with his eternal self, and she is Persephone, or Proserpine, a soul of double nature, living half upon earth and half in Hades, because, having eaten the pomegranate offered her by its lord, her mother could not bring her wholly black to earth. And thirdly, she is Hecate, a thing altogether of hell, barren, hideous, and malicious, the queen of death and evil witchcraft. All these natures are combined in woman. Artemis is unassailable, a being fine and radiant. Hecate is the crone. The woman is past all hope of motherhood, her soul black with envy and hatred of happier mortals. The woman in the fullness of life is the sublime Persephone, for whose sake Demeter cursed the fields, that they brought forth no more corn until Hades consented to restore her to earth for half the year. So this moon of the ancients has a true psychological meaning, as sound today as when the priest of Mithras slew the bull. She is the soul, not the eternal and undying son of the true soul, but the animal soul, which is a projection of it, and is subject to change and sorrow, the play of all the forces of the universe, and whose redemption is the solution of the cosmic problem. For it is the seed of the woman that shall bruise the serpent's head, and this is done symbolically by every woman who wins to motherhood. Others may indeed be chaste unto Artemis, priestess of a holy and ineffable right, but with this exception, failure to attain the appointed goal brings them into the dark side of the moon, the cold and barren house of Hecate, the accursed. Now, of course, one of the issues that we can look at is that that of the fact that chastity and celibacy aren't the same thing. But that idea Pauline Christianity has, actually Pauline Christianity didn't take it that far, but it certainly said that that was the best thing. So both those aspects, have caused a lot of problems in the world. It will be seen, and you understand why a lot of how Aleister Crowley was as a result. It will be seen how wide is the range of these ideas, how sensitive is the formula of woman that can touch such extremes, springing often from one to the other in a moment. According to the nature of the influence then at work upon her, Cyril Gray had once said, speaking at a woman's suffrage meeting, "Woman has no soul, only sex, no morals, only moods. Her mind is mob rule. Therefore, she and only she ought to vote." He had sat down amid a storm of hisses and received 14 proposals of marriage within the next 24 hours. Ever since the beginning of the second stage of the great experiment, Iliel had become definitely a spirit of the moon, while Cyril was with her. She reflected him. She clung to him. She was one with him. Isis to his Osiris, sister as well as spouse, and every thought of her mind being but the harmonic of his. There was no possibility of any internal disturbance, but now she was torn subtly from her support. She could not even speak to her man, and she discovered her own position as the mere center of an experiment. She knew now that she was not of scientific mind, that her aspirations to the unknown had been fully satisfied by mere love, and that she would have been much happier in a commonplace cottage. It says much for the personality of Sister Clara and the force of her invocations, that this first impulse never came to so much as a word. But the priestess of Artemis took hold of her almost with the violence of a lover and whisked her away into a languid ecstasy of reverie. She communicated her own enthusiasm to the girl and kept her mind occupied with dreams, fiery, fervid, of uncharted seas of glory on which her galleon might sail, undiscovered countries of spice and sweetness, El Dorado and Utopia, and the city of God. The hour of the rising of the moon was always celebrated by an invocation upon the terrace consecrated to that planet. A few minutes earlier, Iliel rose and bathed, then dressed herself in the robes and placed upon her head the crescent-shaped tiara with its 9 great moonstones. In this, the younger girls took turns to assist her. When she was ready, she joined the other girl, and together they went down to the terrace where Sister Clara would be ready to begin the invocations. Of course, owing to the nature of the ceremony, it took place an hour later every day, and at first Iliel found a difficulty in accommodating herself to the ritual. The setting of the moon witnessed a second ceremony, directly from which she retired to her bed. It was part of the general theory of the operation thus to keep her concealed and recumbent for the greater part of the day, which, as has been seen, really lasted nearer 25 hours than 24. Well, there's a cycle we all have that's about 25 hours rather than 24 if you turn off our exposure to day and night. But with soft singing and music, or with the recital of slow, voluptuous poetry, her natural disinclination to sleep was overcome, and she began to enjoy the delicious laziness of her existence and to sleep the clock round without turning in her bed. She lived almost entirely upon milk and cream and cheese and soft curd and mild, with little crescent cakes made of rye, with white of egg and cane sugar. As for meat, venison, and sacred to the huntress, Artemis was her only dish, but certain shellfish were permitted, and all soft and succulent vegetables and fruits. She put on flesh rapidly. The fierce, active, impetuous girl of October, with taut muscles and dark flushed mobile face, had become pale, heavy, languid, and indifferent to events, all before the beginning of February. And it was early in this month that she was encouraged by her first waking vision of the moon. Naturally, her sleep had already been haunted by this idea from the beginning. It could hardly have been otherwise with the immediate persistence of the ceremonies. The 3 women always chanted a sacred sentence: Apelthon, Apelthon, Artemis, continuously for an hour after her coaching. Oh, it'd be Artemis or something like that, right? And then one of them went on while the others slept. They would each take a shift, 3 hours. The words were rather droned than sung in an old magical chant, which Sister Clara, who was half Greek, half Italian, born of a noble family of Mytilene, had inherited from some of the women of the island at her initiation as a younger girl into some of their mysteries. They claimed that it had come down unaltered from the great singers of history. It was a drowsy lilt, yet in it was a current of fierce heat like that of the sun, and an undertone of sobbing like the sea. So Iliel's dreams were always of the moon. If the watcher beheld trouble upon her face, as if disturbing influences were upon her, she would breathe softly in her ear and bring her thoughts back to the infinite calm which was desired for her. For Cyril Gray, in devising the operation, had by no means been blind to the daggers involved. In choosing a symbol so sensitive as Luna, there is all the universe between her good and evil sides. In the case of a comparatively simple and straightforward planet like Saturn, this is not the case, and the planets with the backbone are far easier to control. If you once get Mars going, so to speak, it is easy to make him comply with Queensberry rules, but the moon is so passive that the slightest new influence throws her entirely out. And of course, the calmer the pool, the bigger the splash. Hence, in order to draw down to Iliel only the holiest and serenest of the lunar souls, no precaution could be too great, no assiduity too intense. The waking vision which came to her after about a month of the changed routine was of good cheer and great encouragement. It was an hour after sunset. The night was curiously warm, and a soft breeze blew from the sea. It was part of the duty of Iliel to remain in the moonlight with her gaze and her desire fixed upon the orb. Whenever possible, from her room, a stairway led to a tall turret, circular with a glass dome, so as to favor all such observations. But on this night, the garden tempted her. Nox erat et calo fulgabat luna sereno inter minora sidera. The moon hung above Capri. 2 hours from her setting, Iliel held her vigil upon the terrace by the side of the basin of the fountain. When the moon was not visible, she would always replace her by looking upon the sea or upon still water, for these have much in common with the lunar influence. Something she never knew what drew her eyes from the moon to the water. She was so placed that the reflection appeared in the basin at the very edge of the marble, where the water flowed over into little rivulets that coursed the terrace. There was a tremulous movement, almost like a timid kiss, as the water touched the edge. And to the eye of Iliel, it seemed as if the trembling of the moon's image were a stirring of vitality. The thought that followed was a mystery. She said that she looked up, as if recalled to her vigil, and found that the moon was no longer in the sky, nor indeed was there any sky. She was in a grotto whose walls, fantastically draped with stalactites, glimmered a faint purplish blue, very much to the effect, she explained, of luminous paint. She looked down again. The basin was gone. At her feet was a young fawn, snow white, with a collar of silver. She was impelled to read the engraving upon the collar, and was able to make out these words: Siderum regina picornis audi ulna culas. Iliel had learnt no Latin, but these words were not only Latin, but the Latin of Horace, and they were exactly proportionate to the nature of the great experiment. Luna, she had heard, and Regina, and she might have guessed Puellas, and even Sidurum, but it's Sidurum, but that is one thing, and an accurate quotation from Carmen Sacular is another. Yet they stood in her mind as if she had always known them, perhaps even if they were innate in her. She repeated aloud, Siderum Regina Bicornis Audi Luna Puellas. List, O moon, O queen of stars, two-horned. List to the maidens. And what Pula is one of those entities that is given a stellar body, right? You know, in actual astronomy, you have one of those named after her in the solar system. At the time, she had, of course, no idea the meaning of the words. When she had read the inscription, she stroked the fawn gently, and looking up, perceived that a child clad in a kirtle, with a bow and quiver slung from her shoulders, was standing by her. But the vision passed in a flash. She drew her hand across her brow as if to auscultate her mental condition, for she had a slight feeling of bewilderment. No, she was awake, for she recognized the sacred oak under which she was standing. It was only a few paces from the door of the temple where she was priestess. She remembered perfectly now she had come out to bid the herald to blow his horn, and at that moment its spontaneous music greeted her. But what was this? From every tree in the wood, from every blade of grass, from under every stone came running little creatures to answer the summons. They were pale, semi-transparent, with oval but rather flattened heads, quite disproportionately large, thin, match-like bodies and limbs, and snake-like tails attached to the base of their skulls. They were extraordinarily light and active on their feet, and the tails kept up in a lashing movement. The whole effect was comic at the first sight. One might have said tadpoles on stilts, but a closer inspection stayed her laughter. Each of these creatures had a single eye, and in this eye was expressed such force and energy that it was terrifying. The effect was heightened by the sagacity, the occult and profound knowledge of all possible things which dwelt behind those fiery wills. In the carriage of the head was something leonine as well as serpentine. There was extraordinary pride and courage to match the fierce persistency. So we're hinting at Ahriman, are we? Yet there seemed no object in the movements of these strange beings. Their immense activity was unintelligible. It seemed as if they were going through physical exercises, yet it was something more than that. At one moment she fancied that she could distinguish leaders, that this was a body of troops being rallied to some assault. And then her attention was distracted. From her feet arose a swan and took wing over the forest. It must have been there for a long time, for it had laid an egg directly between her sandaled feet. She suddenly realized that she was dreadfully hungry. She would go into the temple and have the egg for breakfast, but no sooner had she picked it up than she saw that it, like the collar of the fawn in her dream, was inscribed with a Latin sentence. She read it aloud. The words were absolutely familiar. They were those of the Labarum of Constantine. In hoc signo vinces. In this sign you shall conquer. You get thrown off sometimes because, you know, one wants to feel like saying church Latin rather than classical Latin, right? But her eyes gave the lie to her ears, for the word signo was spelt cogno. The phrase was then a pun. In this swan thou shalt conquer. But At the time, she did not understand, but she was sure of the spelling when she came afterwards to report her vision to Sister Clara. And if you look at the layout of Mecca, you're going to actually find reference to Cogno, Pretty sure of the spelling when she came afterwards to report her vision to Sister Clara. It then came into her mind that this egg was a great treasure, and that it was her duty to guard it against all comers. And at the same moment she saw the creatures of the wood, sons of the oak, she called them instinctively, were advancing towards her. She prepared to fight or fly. Of course, there's that third option, freeze, right? But with a fearful crackling, the lightning, which was, in the strange way of dreams, identical with the oak, burst in every direction, enveloping her with its blaze, and the crash of the thunder was the fall of the oak. It struck her to the ground. The world went out before her eyes, dissolved into a rainbow rush of stars, and she heard the shouts of triumph of the sons of the oak as they dashed forward upon her ravaged treasure. Mitas ho beas, they shouted. Sister Clara did not know or would not tell its meaning, as the iridescent galaxy in which she was floating gradually faded. She became aware that she was no longer in the wood, but in a strange city. It was crowded with men and women of many a race and color. In front of her was a small house, very poor and squalid, in whose doorway an old man was sitting. A long staff was by his side, leaning against the door, and at his feet was a lantern. Was it a lantern? It was more like the opposite of one, for in the full daylight it burned and shed forth rays of darkness. The ancient was dressed in gray rags. His long unkempt hair and beard had lacked a barber for many a day, but his right arm was wholly bare, and around it was coiled a serpent, gold and green, with the triple crowns, sparkling with ruby, sapphire, and with it he was engraving a great square tablet of emerald. We see, what the Thoth emerald tablet, or, that sort of thing being hinted at. But aside from perhaps teachings of technique being buried in this, certain cosmological things, certain visions that people had could be mentioned here. And there is an objectivity to visions and dreams. It's not all just, just figure out how to interpret it, because there's really real beings and real things in it. So that should be definitely considered as such. But if you pay attention, there's techniques here. And wasn't it Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, were doing rituals inspired by this book? I don't really remember the details of what's said about that, or whether I've got any of that firsthand. I did, but anyways, I mean, from the source material, because people talked about that thing. But, and of course, L. Ron Hubbard, what number 3 in Scientology was Paul Twitchell. So I've done stuff about that movement, and She watched him for some time. When he had finished, he went away with the staff and the lamp and the tablet to the seashore along the coast. He proceeded for some time and came at last to a cave. Iliel followed him to its darkest corner, and there she saw a corpse lying. Strangely, it was the body of the old scribe himself. It came to her very intensely that he had 2 bodies, and that he always kept one of them buried for safety. The old scribe left the tablet upon the breast of the dead man and went very quickly out of the cave. But Iliel remained to read what was written. It was afterwards translated by Cyril Gray, and there is no need to give the original. Utter the word of majesty and terror, true without lie and certain without error. and of the essence of the truth I know the things above are as the things below. The things below are as the things above. To wield the one things thaumaturgy love. As all from one sprang by one contemplation, so all from one were born by permutation. Sun sired, moon bore this unique universe. Air was its chariot, and earth its nurse. Here is the root of every talisman of the whole world since the whole world began. Here is the fount and source of every soul. Let it be split on earth, its strength is whole. Now gently, subtly, with thine art conspire, to find the gross, dividing earth and fire. Lo, it ascendeth and descendeth, even and swift, an endless band of earth and heaven. Thus it receiveth might of duplex love, the powers below conjoined with those above. So shall the glory of the world be thine, and darkness flee before thy sovereign shrine. So VRAN, or if this is supposed to be translated from Hebrew, that would be Semek, Ayin, Wow, Rash, Aleph, Nun, shrine. This is the strong strength of all strength. Surpass the subtle and subdue it, pierce the crass, and solve it, so bring all things to their fated perfection, for by this was all created. O marvel of miracle, O magic mode, all things adapted to one circling code. Since three parts of all wisdom I may claim, Hermes thrice great, and greatest is my name. What I have written of the one sole Son, his work is here divined and dared and done. And in this obscure and antique oracle, so Simon If himself subsequently agreed, the secret of the universe is revealed to those who are worthy to partake of it. My seasonal in May is is going, well, this is released afterwards, but is going to refer to alchemy. But I think the oldest manuscripts of this are in Latin, but there are ones in Hebrew, and it's or Aramaic, and this one seems like it could be rendered from Aramaic. I've been inkling perhaps the original was in Greek, which obviously doesn't make it some pre-dynastic ancient Egyptian writers like it's supposed to be, but you know. Iliel could not understand a word of what was written, but she realized that it must be valuable, and taking the tablet, she hid it in her robe and came out of the cave. Then she saw that the coast was changed. It was the familiar Pasilipo, which hung above her, and she could see Vesuvius away to the right. She turned to breast the steep slope between her and the road, when she found herself confronted by something that she could not see. She had only a feeling that it was black, that it was icy cold, and that it wished to take the tablet from her. Her first sentiment was that of acute hatred and repulsion, but the thing, whatever it was, seemed so wretched that she felt she would like to help it. Then she suddenly glowed hot. The arms of Abdul Bey were around her, and his face was looking into hers. She dropped the tablet hastily. She was back again in a ballroom somewhere thousands of miles and thousands of years away. And then she saw the moon near her setting. Over Capri, she was on the terrace, seated on the ground, perfectly awake, but with the silver crescent from her hair lying upon the marble before her. Now you can certainly transcend place and time in different ways in the visionary experience. Sister Clara, on her knees beside her, was trying to decipher the scratches that she had made. That is the writing on the tablet, said Iliel, as if Sister Clara already knew all about it. That the old man hid in the cave. It was now the hour for her to cradle her limbs in slumber, but while the monotonous chant of her handmaidens wooed the soft air, Cyril Gray and Brother Lefrio were at work upon the inscription. Almost until dawn they toiled, and down in another villa, Another labor reached its climax. Arthwaite had finished his grimoire. He was just in time, for the great operation of necromancy should properly begin on the second day of the waning of the moon, and there were 9 previous days of most arduous preparation. No longer the materials, but of the sorcerers themselves. They must eat dog's flesh and black baked bread without salt or leaven, and they must drink unfermented grape juice, the vilest of all black magical concoctions, for it implies the denial of the divine beatitude and affirms God to be a thing of wood. There were many other precautions also to be taken. The atmosphere of the charnel must be created about them. They must abstain from so much as the sight of women. Their clothing might not be changed even for an hour, and its texture was to be that of cerements for filching the grave clothes from corpses of the unassoiled. They must wrap themselves closely round in them with some hideous travesty of the words of the burial service. A visit to the Jewish graveyard put them in possession of the necessary garments, and Arthwaite's polynode upon the resurrection unto damnation left in each mind due impression of the ghastliness of their projected rite. And what I know in my country about Jewish graveyards, they tend to be more secure, so there's going to be problems if you yeah, even more likely if you do that. And in Paris, Douglas, smashing the neck of a bottle of whiskey on the edge of the table, was drinking the good health of his visitor, an American woman of the name of Cremers. Her squat, stubborn figure was clad in rusty black clothes, a man's, except for the skirt. It was surmounted by a head of unusual size and still more unusual shape, for the back of the skull was entirely flat, and the left frontal lobe much more developed than the right. One could have thought that it had been deliberately knocked out of shape, since nature, fond it may be of freaks, rarely pushes a symmetry to such a point. There would have been more than idle speculation of such a theory, for she was the child of hate, and her mother had in vain attempted every violence against her before her birth. The face was wrinkled parchment, yellow and hard. It was framed in short, thick hair, dirty white in color, and her expression denoted that the utmost cunning and capacity were at the command of her rapacious instincts, but her poverty was no indication that they had served her, and those primitive qualities had in fact been swallowed up in the results of their disappointment, for in her eye raved bitter a hate of all things, born of the selfish envy which regarded the happiness of any other person as an outrage and affront upon her. Every thought in her mind was a curse against God, against man, against love, our beauty, against life itself. She was a combination of the witch burner with the witch, an incarnation of the spirit of Puritanism, from its sourness to its sexual degeneracy and perversion. Douglas put the broken glass to his mouth and gulped down a bumper of whiskey. Then he offered the bottle to his visitor. She refused by saying that it played hell with the astral body, and asked her host to give her the price of the drink instead. Douglas laughed like a madman, a somewhat disgusted madman, for in him was some memory of his former state, and even his fall had been comparatively decent. The floor of his hell a ceiling to her heaven, but he had a use for the hag, and he contemptuously tossed her a franc. She crawled over the floor like some foul instinct in search of it, for it had rolled to a corner, and having retrieved it, she forgot her mannish assumptions in her excitement at the touch of silver, and thrust it into her stocking. And chapter 15 is going to be of Dr. Vesquit and his companions, how they fared in their work of necromancy, and at the council of war of Cyril Gray and Brother Onofrio, with certain opinions of the former upon the art of magic. And so there's a note, the spelling is in Greek translations, courtesy of Mabapua, italics are mine. Appeared, all, no. And so Let's go a little. Sometimes Crowley has, okay. Apelthon, Artemis. Because you don't always know Crowley's spelling or if the spelling's right or what the meaning of some of the things he throws in, but obviously that would have been Greek, so